Hello and welcome to our advanced course on Excel 2013. My name is Toby and I'm your instructor on this course. In this first section I'd like to talk about some of the prerequisites of the course and some basic ideas about how the course is organized. So let's get started. Now the first prerequisite is going to seem rather obvious, but I'm going to mention it anyway, and that is that you need a copy of Excel 2013 installed and working. You might think that you can work through this course with an older version, but you can't, because there are some things in Excel 2013 that are different from earlier versions. If you are going to try to work along with this course with an earlier version, then you are going to get a little bit confused when I talk about things that don't exist in earlier versions, or you find something in an earlier version that doesn't exist in Excel 2013. It is different from earlier versions, and some of those differences are covered in this course. The other thing to point out, if you don't have an installation already, is that if you're just going to sort of work through the course, watch what I do, maybe you're trying to find out if Excel 2013 can do what you want to do, that's fine. But I do rather rely on you practicing the material that I cover. I'm going to be setting you some exercises to do. There are some example files provided with the course, and really it's quite important that you do that practice. So although you can just watch along and probably learn a lot from what we cover, there's no substitute for getting in plenty of practice as we work our way through the course. Now for the next prerequisite. I am going to assume that you have a good basic to intermediate knowledge of how to use Excel 2013. The level of knowledge that I'm going to assume is the equivalent of our basic to intermediate Excel 2013 training course. You can look at the content on our website, go through the list of chapters there. That's what I'm going to assume you know. If we take a particular example, there's a section here in the second half, functions case study. Functions, the first area we're going to cover on this advanced course, and I'm going to assume that you've used functions a little. You know something about the types, date and time functions, logical functions, text functions, but then we're going to look into functions in a lot more detail on this advanced course. And if you haven't used them at all before, you might find this is a very steep, quite tricky learning curve to start from scratch. So I'm really going to assume that you've got that basic knowledge of functions in place, and that you have some familiarity with the use of functions based on your use of Excel 2013 before. If you've learned basic Excel somewhere else, maybe you've even taught yourself basic Excel before, that's fine, but do take the time to go through this list and make sure that you can pretty much tick everything in this list and say, yep, I know about that, yeah, I understand that, and make sure there aren't any big gaps, because the big gaps will potentially cause you problems later on in this course. If you're a user of a touch device, then you should be familiar with the fact that Office 2013 is very much geared towards use with a touch device as an alternative to mouse and keyboard. And in fact, in our basic to intermediate course, we spend a reasonable amount of time talking about the ways of doing things in Excel using a touch device. The use of a touch device is a little bit less significant on the advanced course, because with the advanced course it's very much more about the use of Excel in specific situations. So there's a lot more work related to case studies and applications of Excel rather than the operation of the interface itself. So the use of touch in this course is really quite limited. Having said that, there isn't really anything in the course that you can't do using touch, and the one proviso or reservation I would make is that sometimes doing the things that we're talking about on this course using your fingers can be more clumsy, maybe a little bit more awkward than it is with mouse and keyboard. Having said that, and as you should be familiar with, there are some ways of adapting the Excel interface in 2013 using touch mode and so on, which can make it very much easier to use a touch device than it is in some Windows applications. On the occasions that the use of a touch device does offer a different challenge, I'll refer to those at the time. Generally speaking though, if you're familiar with how to do the basics of Excel using a touch device, and there is a section on this in our basic to intermediate course, then pretty much what's in there is going to be all you need to know to cover the use of touch in the advanced course as well. So you're going to need to know obvious things like tap and hold, but also things like pinch, swipe and so on we'll be using from time to time, and I won't generally be demonstrating things twice, that is, once with mouse and keyboard and once with touch. Now, as part of this course you're given access to a folder full of sample files, and the folder will look something like this in terms of content. There may be a slightly different number of files, these things do change over time, the dates may be different, but you need to know where that folder is and you need to be able to access those files simply because I'm going to be referring to them from time to time throughout the course. I also use another folder, what I'll call my scratch folder. Sometimes I'll be working on files to demonstrate things and you won't necessarily have a copy of those, so sometimes you'll hear me refer to my scratch folder. Now, one very important aspect of Excel is that it is truly multilingual and multinational. And for the purposes of this course, although I'm based in the UK and my locale is UK, for most of the time I will be using the United States locale. So that will involve using the US dollar as my main currency, and it will involve using things like the US spell checker. Now, I will from time to time vary from this. The locale, the currency setting, etc. should really not make any difference to you. Use your own locale, use your own currency settings. When you're working in the sample files, which are basically prepared for the US locale, feel free to change them to suit your own locale and make sure that you understand what the key differences are. And now just a couple of other important points before we get started. One of them is that in Excel, particularly in more recent versions of Excel, there are many ways of doing most things, and it would be an extremely long course if I showed you every way of doing everything. That means that generally speaking I'll show you one or two ways, and there will certainly be others in almost every case, and you may prefer one of those other ways. I'll try to vary the way I do things, I'll try to discuss the pros and cons of doing things in certain ways, but almost everybody has their own combination of ways that they like to do things in Excel, and it's never quite the same as somebody else's combination of ways. So do feel free to experiment, and if you find a better way of doing something, a way that suits your style better, all well and good. Amongst examples of this kind of variation are things like keyboard shortcuts. I don't use keyboard shortcuts very much because I have trouble remembering them all because of the number of different pieces of software that I use. But some of the common keyboard shortcuts, like things for cut, copy and paste, creating new workbooks, saving files and so on, which are pretty much common across certainly all of the components of Office 2013, I do use. So I have my own combination of keyboard shortcuts that I use, although the majority I don't. I won't be going into things like the keyboard shortcuts of everything in detail on this advanced course. Via the online help you can get a list of those. If you prefer using keyboard shortcuts, then I'm afraid I'm going to have to leave that to you. Although, as I say, I do use them in certain situations and I will mention them from time to time. The second important point to mention is that the content of this course is quite technical in places, and some of the applications that we cover, statistics, maths, engineering, finance and so on, are really quite specialist applications. This is a course on Excel, it's not a course on statistics. So although there is a certain amount of statistics in the course, I won't be spending a long time explaining to you what regression and correlation are. So if we look at a particular topic, and it's not a topic you know anything about, I will try to cover the basics, but you may need to do a little bit of separate reading or investigation to find out more about that topic. Having said that, as far as possible, I've tried to choose case studies, applications and examples that are as far as possible in contact with most people's everyday lives. So when it comes to things like financial applications, we're looking at things like house loans or car loans and repayments, that sort of thing, not some sort of specialist financial application. So there we are, that's all of the preparatory material I intend to cover. In the next section we're going to get started on doing some work with Excel 2013, so please join me for that.